My first hand was an air elemental, a gift of steel, and a fragmenter. The land cost of fragmenter is too high to keep in my starting hand, and the gift of steel doesn't have a guaranteed use on a combat effect unit. Luckily, I draw both a Grimguard and an Underground Brigand. My mistake here was playing a desert instead of two prairies, since I wouldn't be able to play anything turn 1 anyway. The opponent builds their land in a curve here and places an unlikely hero on the end of it. It's my second turn, so I would be able to summon units that don't have low health or damage. Their unit could be spending time gathering Faeria in the back instead of wasting whatever value the card has in the center. I make my V, so I have reach of both wells. The opponent could try to take the land right beside my elemental, but I'd be able to cut that off and then expand northeastward without much contest. Since I didn't try to aggressively assert myself center against their unlikely hero, I ended up allowing them to retreat and gather Faeria with that unit. Seeing that their Cylind Warrior would be in range of my elemental, I retreated it back to gather Faeria as well. The land I placed could have went north 1 tile to give me an extra hex to summon on, seeing how the elemental is flying. At this point, my hand is looking rather nice. I've been sitting on my Faeria collection, so I can drop a Grimguard down on the new mountain I placed and buff it with a Gift of Steel. The opponent would have to spend a high number of resources to remove it, giving me plenty of time to figure out my follow-up.
Well met.
Grimguard's HP is too high to beat down in 1 turn, so I end up burning 6 life from the opponent over both of our turns. Trading the elemental might not have been necessary, but it allows me to prevent my Herald of War from taking large unnecessary damage if the opponent decided to hit it. The opponent could have a Falcon Dive, and maybe a Campfire seeing that they are running a neutral deck. That would have been enough to remove my Grimguard and the Herald in 1 turn. My board is largely empty and I need Faeria. Brigand goes down next to address both of those issues. My opponent plays Hold the Line, but otherwise sits on their large Faeria pool, leading me to suspect something big might be played in the coming turns. Krog is in my hand now, so another mountain is warranted, seeing how close I am to being able to play him. The land goes down in a choice location where the opponent can waste time trying to surround with their own land. A Bursting Hippo or a buff Grimguard would find great effect here. Battling Tax Collector with my Herald could not have been a more ideal fight for my unit. It's tempting to use Gift of Steel in my units, but I make the prudent decision against it. The opponent's walking fortress hits the board, as well as a cutthroat bandit. I make sure to grab Faeria from the wells before taking actions and trade for the bandit. The position on the new land and a buffed bursting hippo should end the game faster than the opponent could damage me. If I was paying attention, or just playing smart and safe, I could have dealt with this without losing any life to begin with. The opponent showed that they had Imperial Guards earlier, and I should have expected seeing as much from a neutral deck anyway. My second hippo is placed in an awful position. I should have aimed to the right of the opponent's Maceman. To attack it directly with his fortress, the Maceman would have had to take out the Grimguard, which could have been done with a campfire or falcon dive if he had it. Either way, my hippo would have been able to move in, hit the Maceman, and get indirect damage on the fortress. I also should have attacked the fortress when given the opportunity. These mistakes would have resulted in my loss against an opponent with better decision-making skills. In this match, playing defensively with this deck was clearly the better option, and experimenting with being aggressive shows that. Speaking of playing defensively, I ran into the opposite circumstances in match 2. On my turn, I remember to play my Explore card first, before placing lands. This way I can branch out in the opposite direction if I need to, while still having both mountains and choice locations on my side of the board. Seeing the archer made me nervous, since I haven't ran into someone using ranged units before. This is also fresh off of last match, where I learned how vulnerable I am if I'm trying to be aggressive. Although expensive, I placed both of my heralds early and in range of the Faeria wells. As I place lands for both of them to advance, I should be able to assert myself strongly on the left side of the board. By the time I close the distance, I can place Grimguard and Bursting Hippo down to tie up the remaining units, take out the archer or archers if more are summoned, and clean up with Hippo's area of effect. I do have plenty of more options within my deck than this, but this is what I have guaranteed in my hand. I have to plan around what I do have, and not what I might have. For example, I could craft this big combo around Scourgeflame Spectre and for a one-turn kill, but I'm not guaranteed to have that every single time I play the game. If all I do is bank on one strategy, then my gameplay will be too rigid to actually answer any of the problems that my opponent gives me. Any interruptions to that plan will basically mean a loss, and if that's all I'm practicing learning when I'm playing, then I'm not going to learn how to actually play the game because I'm not engaging with it otherwise. Grimguard was summoned because I figured the opponent could tie up my heralds with taunt on the front line, so I invested in guarding my core from direct hits early. They also summoned a structure with taunt on the same turn, but I think that was unnecessarily risky. If I had a Flame Burst, then I could spend Faeria for the convenience, or I could use it as a free combat for one of my Heralds of War. An engineer is placed down as insurance against my surviving herald. It's a shame to see it used like this, but desperate times. Anyway, when my brigand hits the board, it ends up juiced up 4 times from the previous combats. Since my core is currently safe, the Grimguard is moved so I can grab extra Faeria or move back in front of the core if necessary later on. Building up for my Scourgeflame Spectre can wait, since this is a choice time to build up my front line of land. I want to play Underground Boss next turn, but Red Devil is also tempting. My card and my Faeria advantage is rather large right now, and I want to snowball that lead even further if I can. The opponent shot themselves in the foot by placing the Court Jester. I can destroy the Shimmering Statue for more free Faeria, while giving my Brigand yet another opportunity to earn even more Faeria. Sadly, I pass this opportunity up to deal some damage directly through Grimguard's combat effect. My Brigand can tank a hit for the core anyway, and it being destroyed allows me to summon other units onto that spot. The Grimguard is immediately threatening the opponent's archers as well, so they have to choose to flee or trade. Attacking the weakest unit my opponent had near my Grim allows it to deal more total damage, and I'm able to block my core for more damage without him having the body block for me. Using Bloodsong here is rather risky, but I'm confident in my ability to close the match out at this point. Red Devil might be too fragile to survive a hit from the opponent's Hilltop Archer if Steamforge procs on it, so Boss is summoned instead. Hippo is too valuable to use as meat shield at the moment. Instead of placing more land, I decided to draw. I top deck a Gift of Steel, which is both funny and absolutely what I needed this turn. I could have beefed up my Grimguard, but he probably wouldn't survive many more combats anyway.
Why so serious?
This new opening allows me to drop my Scourge Flame down on the new desert in the opponent's territory. I summon Bursting Hippo's Insurance, and the match is more or less settled here. Using Scorch Flame as a surprise was very satisfying, even if I was using its base stats. It's a near perfect example of the situations I pictured when I thought and talked about the card in the last video. Going into the third match, I have to shift gears once again. In the first match, I should have played balanced. In the second match, I was forced into playing aggressively and made much better decisions. And in this match, I have to deal with someone playing very aggressively against me. In hindsight, taking Krog was very unsafe and greedy, but having him in your starting hand could see him on the board in a matter of turns. However, it does pay to play safe. The same start as last time, even though I had to remind myself to do so. Nothing too exciting, but I can tell early on that the opponent might try to rush me from how early they took center tile. Time of Legends makes me nervous since it's a strong and inexpensive search card to draw early. Speaking of top decking something useful, I'm able to place more special lands down with the help of my Air Elemental. This might give the opponent the impression I have yellow control cards to be mindful of. Early on, it can be helpful to keep the opponent unaware of your options, but it can also be helpful to nod at the possibility of options that you don't actually have in the event that the opponent will act more cautiously because of it. trading that Origin Monk for my air elemental feels like a huge waste to me. Drawing Fragmenter this early is actually really nice, in case I have to deal with multiple units with high damage but low HP. The opponent can block me off from my left Faeria well, but threatening their Faeria generation while reducing the effective cost of my underground boss to 1 was too tempting. The opponent had 3 deserts, so they might have wanted to place another for their legend if the cost was that high. This would give me an opportunity to fill in lands around my core, but that wasn't to be so. The jump into placing lands around my core took me by surprise, but I wasn't immediately threatened by it. Grimguard moves back in front of my core to cover both tiles in the event my opponent summons something with haste. Herald's War was summoned as support. With Grimguard destroyed, I have to use Herald to cover my core. In the event I manage Krog, I place him mounted prematurely to block my opponent's land pathing on the right. The opponent adding even more land around my core actually feels like a waste. There's no advantage to really gain from this, and they could have helped their hand size or Faeria count instead. Placing Fragmenter down now is tempting, but bursting Hippo was the better option. If the opponent doesn't fill in that last land, it gives me an alternative staging point for any of my aggressive summons, and Hippo is in range to use its area of effect once or twice depending on how the opponent decides to deal with it. While I have a foothold on the right, I also needed one on the left, so 2 more prayers are placed. The Zealous Crusader place was quite the oddity. Grimguard will tie them up, and my land was allowed to go down. taking the extra Faeria instead of placing another desert at summon location because of that, and also taking the combat were big mistakes. If the opponent took more time to make this decision, they might have been able to fight back. Speaking of mistakes, my Fragmenter goes down too early since I decided to take the trade after the fact.
Embrace the wild wind.
Luckily it didn't matter, and I was able to close the match out without having to contend with any real defense.